We're gathered via Zoom to talk about an exhibition of sculpture by John Chamberlain at Gagosian Gallery. With me on this Zoom are, as usual, Brant Johnso and Jock Ireland. We've been joined for the discussion of Chamberlain by the sculptor Lee Tribe. Zoom is being recorded and will be edited and posted by the multi-talented Rachel Bolander. Thank you, Lee. Thank you, Rachel.
Yeah.
We're doing this via Zoom and not in front of the actual works in the gallery because, unfortunately, the gallery would not allow us to do it in the gallery. We have, thanks to Rachel, some video and photographs of the works in the show, which we will be looking at as we talk. John Chamberlain was born in 1927 and died in 2011. He's best known for sculptures made from crushed motorcar body parts welded together. And this exhibition was mainly comprised of works of this kind. The exhibition was mentioned in our previous forum, which was about the work of Joel Shapiro. That was because we had just been looking at the Chamberlain works, and the contrast between the two was striking. I had some words for that contrast, but I deleted them and saved them for later. So would anybody like to start?
Oh, I can say that the bit that was in the Joel Shapiro forum, Brant was talking about Chamberlain being working with reflexes, and that that was interesting to me, and I thought I did not sure that I understood what Brant was meant by reflexes, but I thought of Derek Jeter, you know, the former shortstop for the New York Yankees, and the way an athlete works with or works by reflex, or you can maybe describe an athlete working by reflex, and that's sort of without thinking. Jeter would grab a baseball and throw it to first base, and maybe Chamberlain sort of grabs bits of auto body parts and makes a sculpture out of them, kind of without thinking. And it's that thinking dimension that I find missing in the work. It's in many ways exciting, just as Derek Jeter was exciting to watch. But there's something missing.
Is that what you kind of had in mind, Brant? Is Jock interpreting your thought appropriately?
Yeah, pretty fairly. I mean, Amy Silman makes a really broad case for Chamberlain, and I wouldn't argue with it, but this stuff is not moving to me, and it seems in many ways to be a fairly straightforward form of collage on really pretty purely formal terms. And I know that there's all kinds of ways to introduce or to see content in it, but I really see something that's kind of instinctively rather than deliberatively, meditatively, visually thoughtful. and it really seems as if he can, I don't know, I mean, starting with some general sense of a piece, he really can move from, you know, element to element additively, on a kind of a visual reflex basis. I think that beyond that, I mean, it would be, you know, and really they're all about composition, and yet the composition is sort of, you can't imagine it being put up, taken down, or sort of roughed out and, you know, thought over,
Yeah, Brant, you say that.
completed.
Sorry. You say that about composition, but composition within a kind of pretty predictable framework, aren't they? I mean, the works seem to be either contained within a sort of form of a blob or a column or somewhere in between. They sometimes,
Right.
you know, extend beyond that, or you know, the blob gets crushed in on one side, or you know, there is variation, but generally speaking, the overall kind of structure image is contained within a frame, almost as if that is a given, as if you're painting.
Exactly. There's a great many parallels to painting in this work, but it seems that the deepest one, in a sense, is that sense of the arena being, you know, almost like arms spread surface that ends at a perimeter. Even though, you know, the pieces are all round. And of course, that critique, that objection has got, you know, as many counter objections as there are individual pieces. But yeah, as a rule, it's a kind of a central collage. It's aspatial. And when you compare it to sculpture that went on at the same time, I mean, like, elegant example would be Caro. There's, you know, Caro has 100 ways to spread something out, to establish points in space.
Yeah, they're very similar dates, aren't they? I mean, in terms of their lifespan, and they're both working in steel, and they both used color, at least from time to time. Caro used color. It's an interesting comparison, and yet it's not a comparison you would think to make.
Right, and they both used material that they would pick up at the scrapyard. It had a previous history.
Yes,
and they both used it. But interesting, I've been reading what I can about Chamberlain, and nobody ever actually uses the word scrapyard. And his material is crumpled, and you need a machine, a compressing machine, to do that. And they don't actually mention that. And one of the things I read about, he was actually described as attacking the material and, you know, banging it and beating it into submission, which I don't think he did at all. I don't think he was particularly physical with his pieces, except where it was really necessary. And with the composition thing, something it said that he was searching for the right fit, rearranging compositions until they locked into place. And I can understand that to a certain extent, but and the other thing that struck me was that he was the one sculptor that I can think of that followed the lead of the abstract expressionist painters.
well, it's clear that that's where the aesthetic is coming from, isn't it? But
Yeah.
but in some ways, the process it has to be quite different. I mean, while there's an implied gesture in some of the works with the way the parts move, the actual production of it could not have involved gesture.
Right. So as Pollock would make a drip, swirl, Chamberlain would find a piece of material that contains something like that, but he didn't actually develop that swirl, that mark.
No, and he put pieces together in order to kind of extend or
Yeah, in a three-dimensional way.
Create that sense of movement. And this work, I mean, found myself both fascinated and somewhat repelled by this work. I mean, but I found myself in the end wondering, what is it celebrating? Because there is a kind of celebratory kind of quality to it, I think. And apart from, well, I also found myself reflecting on the discussion we had about the Tom Doyle show, where Jock was insisting that those works of Tom's from the 60s were American. And I didn't really understand that. We did go on about it a bit, but I didn't really understand what it was that was being referenced. Whereas I would have thought this work was essentially felt somehow or other, to be American and to be celebrating something about American culture, its romance with the automobile, its conspicuous consumption. I don't know.
Well, it's non-European.
Yeah. I mean, coming out of abstract expressionism.
Yes. Yes. And I don't know if it's pertinent, but last night I was teaching on Zoom with Rachel, help as my teacher as well. And somebody presented Peter Volkus, who's big ceramic sculptures.
Yeah.
Were being, and there's an affinity I've just realized between Chamberlain and Volkus.
Yeah, Lee, there is a connection, and it goes back to abstract expressionism, doesn't it? Volkus was able to do things with clay that were where the clay would respond directly to the action of his hand or arm. In a way that is implied in this steelwork, but is not real. I mean, it's not real in the sense that it is a consequence of the action of Chamberlain's, gesture.
I think that in terms of Chamberlain saying he was looking for a point at which composition locks in, I think that lock-in threshold for me, I mean, no objection, but for me, it's a low threshold. The pictorial quality and relief quality I find kind of modest. I mean, he's a wonderful colorist, of course, and really shrewd at pre-manipulating material, selecting material for a particular piece, and a great improviser. But there's this general slightness that I find in each aspect, even of the things that I find most impressive about this work.
Yeah.
And that's just a for me thing. I mean, I wouldn't ask anyone else to ascribe to that, but
I ascribe to it.
I ascribe to it too. Sorry.
Yeah, it's just stuff accumulates rather than locking in the pieces. It's just an agglomeration of stuff rather than a composed de Kooning painting. where
Yeah.
everything fits.
Yeah, it does fall under the assemblage bracket. The conglomerations
Yeah,
are what they're called, as well as agglomerations.
yeah, conglomeration is good, and it feels somewhat as if the lock-in point comes when you can't stuff anything more into the the given kind of outline that has been established. I mean, there are rhythms and points of reference within that frame, but on the whole, it ends up feeling, on the one hand, somewhat bombastic, and on the other hand, slightly decorative.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'd watch that bombast. There's a nice lightness to the things that keeps it away from bombast. It seems to me, and the I don't know, the Americanness is it's there, and I think of tumbleweeds in the Texas desert. There are nice things about the Chamberlain stuff.
Yeah, but I mean, I see that, and there certainly are things that are pleasing, but that's putting aside the overall kind of impression that is given, the overall message that is there. I mean, it's as if there's some kind of sweetness within the I don't know. I mean, I use the word bombast. I mean, I think maybe that's over the top, but certainly there's a kind of ambition to be sort of thunderous in some way.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the earliest sculpture in this show, I think one of his first metal sculptures, and you can clearly see the influence of Smith and probably Gonzalez too in that one. And so you can see there's a guy who wants to make some sculpture but is a bit uncertain, and he did begin in that one apparently to use some fenders off of two fenders off of was it Larry Rivers' car, one of the painters, off of the car that he used. So that was the first time he used car parts. But so I think he began to find his voice with these crumpled steel things, and the steel of the early 50s automobiles is much heavier. It was a heavy gauge steel.
Yeah.
Which lent certain properties to the material, and the paint was on it, but he did also apply paint. So it all just leaves me with I've liked them very much, but I'm still left with, as I get older, I don't know why, but there's a sense of uncertainty that lingers with me. There's lots that I like, but I'm just left with a sense of uncertainty.
Yeah, he was an artist he had a career. He had a successful career that he worked hard at, but he was working hard at the career. He never sort of had doubt or worked as a sculptor or as a real having problems with and struggling with sculptural ideas. He had problems with his career and he struggled with that, but it was a career, and it seems to me he was a nice guy, a fun guy, someone who sort of didn't take himself too seriously. And it's that not taking himself or not taking sculpture too seriously. I mean, it allowed for a kind of lightness and I don't know, nice pleasure, a dimension of pleasure that is very sort of necessary for success in the American art world. But he I don't know. I think Lee's right when he putting his finger on this uncertainty. He wasn't sure about what sculpture really is.
That's interesting. That's interesting, Jock. I think I think there's a kind of paradox in the work in that in some way the struggle is in the way the material has been struggled with in its crumpling and bending and cutting and tearing and crushing and that speaks of conflict, of confrontation, of battle, but at the same time, you don't feel the composing of those bits of metal that have been so beaten up. The composing of them has been a problem. It seems too easy. They seem to nestle together very comfortably and in a very almost predictable kind of way. They just sort of snuggle together, and that seems to be a paradox. But the sense that the work in terms of its composition has been a problem. It doesn't feel like it was ever a problem. And the suggestion that there was any difficulty is in the way the material has been beaten up. That's where the struggle is referenced. So in terms of his what you're saying about him, I don't know about his character, whether he was a fun guy or anything, but that seems to me to be a kind of inherent paradox in the work that is not interesting or resolved. I mean, paradoxes in works are interesting, but here they just seem to be a departure between the two possibilities. The material is handled in a way that implies something, and yet when it finishes up in the work, it's become pretty.
Yeah, I think something that came to my mind is that the crumpling equals discarded material. It can no longer be used in its role in its previous existence. Like the hood of a car could be put onto another car, but once it's been crumpled, you can't do that anymore. So there's this discarded sense, like thrown away bits of crumpled paper. So, and I think that's I think that was important to Chamberlain, that discarded nature of the material. I think it kind of lessened it in making it a little impoverished.
Yeah, or you just didn't have to take it completely seriously. It allowed him to work with the stuff without really engaging in what I'm calling sculptural issues. Or
well, what's not clear at all, I think, is the extent to which the bits of material that we are witnessing were found in the state in which we see them, or whether they have been manipulated and crumpled by Chamberlain. I mean, I think they had to have been manipulated and crumpled by Chamberlain often.
I think he probably had access in a scrapyard to the machines that do that.
Yeah.
And otherwise, they'd be more compressed.
Yeah, otherwise, yeah. So he clearly had access to the machine, so he was manipulating the material.
Yeah.
So in some sense, I mean, what you say, Lee, is true, although he may have been finding perfectly good motor car parts and partially kind of making them be unusable himself.
Yes, that's. I believe he had to be involved in the crumpling, but I don't think he did that much. I think if a piece wouldn't fit, he might bang the edge to make it fit or something like that. But I think in the crumpling, it's done in a machine that he may have overseen.
Yeah.
The process of. So he got the kind of crumple he wanted. I mean, if you want to see a really compressed automobile sculpture, look at Cesar.
Yeah.
They're the best compressed sculptures of their type. They're fantastic in their sense of compression, which these lack. These are crumpled. You used the word earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you take a Cesar and, you know, I don't know, you put it in the ocean and it'll sink to the bottom of the ocean just like that. That Chamberlain, it has a lightness about it that's nice, that's different from Cesar. And you know, and I want to bring in Bill Tucker, William Tucker, and his sort of well, the later work. How does that compare with the? I mean, it seems there are some similarities with Chamberlain, or how do people feel about that?
Yeah, there's something there. I think we're sort of passing over a lot of things that are impressive about Chamberlain, that they, you know, with essentially no depiction, they are a kind of portrait of their time and of a moment, and they have a kind of a freshness and an openness and this, you know, this ability to make form of color, you know, whether by improvisation or I think considerable design, because I think he was very careful in choosing materials and in prepping materials for a particular piece, a particular set of pieces. I think, you know, if you were going to make a closer comparison between his work and another artist, I think the later reliefs of stelas on the wall or on the floor are a pretty fair matchup. And for me, they're both pretty, well, for me, pretty entirely a matter of form. And I would guess that the artist would argue for this what I think a kind of empty sense of form being a kind of full content. For me, I don't feel that. I find them each somewhat vacant, and I much prefer Chamberlain's work. I think Chamberlain's is far more emotionally active and invested than Stella's.
Yeah, for sure. I can't connect him to Stella at all, but I can connect him to Tucker. There is, or I don't know. Stella does fall apart completely to me.
I agree with Brand about and with Jock about connection with Stella and the preference for Chamberlain over the Stella works that Brant was referring to. As regards Bill Tucker, I see why you would make that reference in terms of the sense of imagery that is going on in these works. But I think Bill is playing with imagery. He's playing with the kind of way in which an object can contain an image and hide it, be the thing that is imaged in the object, and yet be also, an object. I don't find this real imagery in this work, in that sense of, that if you kind of engage it long enough and appropriate enough, you'll find a figure or a head or a donkey or a horse, and then lose it again and find it again. I don't think there's that playing with imagery here that I sense is something that engages Bill.
Right, well, Tucker is essentially volume, and these are as much air as volume.
Well, I would use the word mass for Tucker rather than volume.
Mass. Yeah.
These purport to be masses, but they're actually, hollow, empty, and I mean, I hear what you say, Brant, and I agree. I mean, there is something very impressive about these works.
Yeah.
But what's impressive is often the scale and the manipulation of the material, the way the material has been tortured. Is engaging. But I mean, I think, as I said in the Shapiro show, I think they aim to be impressive. They aim to impress. They don't draw you in and engage you in a kind of articulate conversation.
I enjoy it. So like in some of the bigger ones where there's a passage of similar parts, makes a little rhythm going through it that is different to the abutting rhythms below and above. And I found that, I think they're probably later works, but I really quite enjoyed some of those things. And there is something wonderful about them in one way. But like I say, in the end, I'm just a little unsatisfied somehow. I want to like them in many ways. See, there's a nice passage in this one that's on the screen now.
Yeah, and something that happens in a number of the works, either they seem to be thoroughly kind of consistent throughout, or they often seem to be bisected, or, to have one half largely in one color and the other half largely in another color. There often seems to be that kind of, but yeah, no, I think we seem to be in agreement that the work is on the whole impressive and gives there's much to be enjoyed in it, and yet we seem to feel some kind of dissatisfaction at the same time. I wonder if that isn't, a kind of what I've referred to before, a kind of consequence of the paradox between the effect and the total effect of the object on the viewer, and the way in which the material that it's composed of has been, I used the word tortured a minute ago. It seems to be.
Yeah, that I have, if you want tortured metal, go to Robin Greenwood. But there's pleasure in Chamberlain. There's color there. It's not tortured.
Well, that's what I'm suggesting, Jock, I think, is that there is pleasure and color and joy in
Yeah.
in the object as a total ensemble. And yet the individual bits that it's composed of are not about, I don't feel are, they seem to carry a message of something that has been brutalized.
Well,
And that's a paradox and a contrast and in a way perhaps an interest in the work. And yet I feel in some way it I don't know, I was not sort of enthralled with that paradox.
yeah.
Yeah. His mentors were a couple of painters, I believe. I think one was Franz Klein. And I think that stays with him. And when I look at them and get involved in the paint, I do find I explore more. I get involved in certain passages, not all of them. There's some that I don't get into at all. But the telltale sign for me was I started looking at how they were joined, how the welding was done, what was cut, what was ground. And when I start looking for details like that, I'm losing some of my focus on the sculpture itself thing, to the point where I could identify probably 4 different sculptors or artists rather, people working for him by their welding, which has got nothing much to do with the piece.
Well, it's not uninteresting though, is it? I mean, because if you look at Gonzalez and you look at the welding, it is so sensitive in a way. It's so such a feeling, I mean, and here the welding is done by a variety of people. You're suggesting, Lee, and that,
Yeah,
that's it's another element. I mean, maybe it's a word I should use about the way the material itself has been dealt with by Chamberlain and by machines is arbitrary. Whatever happens. If we put this much pressure on it here, in the machine in this way, then we get something.
I think there's an element of that, but I think in those very tall ones, tall and somewhat slender, there's some very long runs of white or creamy colored metal, and they're crushed a little bit all in the same way. So there is coherence there. It's less than arbitrary.
Yes. It's as if the manipulation of the material, which was in the earlier work relatively kind of unpredictable, begins to be calculable and within a frame, within a range.
It's a bit like we can do this and we can do it this way, and we will get something like this.
Yeah, so there's an element of control.
There is definitely and desire. The artist's desire for that.
Intention,
yes.
Yeah.
I think we should mention that Chamberlain is one of a number of American artists, essentially post-war artists, who in some fashion or another believe strongly that if they make a thing that is only itself, that is somehow undepictive or as little depictive as possible, that they can achieve another kind of image or a kind of a non-image that could be as emotional and as intellectually challenging and you know, I guess somehow summatory, cumulative would be the word for Chamberlain, of course, you know, to be as rich and ambitious an experience as visual art had been previously. In his work, I see that happening and appreciate it. And I still, somehow I just find that reflexive, formal, conclusive process is for me still somehow underweight.
Yeah, you can't get away from the loaded character of the material and the state that it's in. That is loaded with information, so you know, your object has that, whatever you want to call it, that weight of history and information that is being it's being made out of, and you know, the sense in which it isn't about that is, you know, the sense in which it's about giving pleasure or something. That's the paradox that I keep coming back to, and that seems to be, right, it's not a paradox, it's a contradiction.
Yeah, that's it. You know, the cars, and the car wrecks, and just cars, what they do to the environment and all that stuff. He doesn't engage with that at all. It's all just sort of pretty things to make a sculpture out of. The implications of what the sculpture is made out of are just that. Just Chamberlain doesn't think about it.
Yeah, they're ignored, aren't they? I mean, they're ignored,
right.
And the
And
material.
I think he would agree with you.
I would disagree there.
No,
Okay.
Yeah, he said that his work is not about car crashes.
Well,
That's
that-
what he said. He insisted on that.
Yeah, well, he can insist on it for all he wants, but it
I
is.
know, but
it
it's
is
still
about-
there, isn't it?
It's inescapable. And,
Yes.
and the disaster that is implied is inescapable, and yet it's totally it was denied in the work. It's not unengaged. It's
Well, he
denied.
would agree with that, though. Yeah, I mean, I did have a sense that people may have died when I was looking at some of the elements. I just thought, goodness, people could have died in this.
Yeah, there's something going on there that is troubling. And I think that's what we feel in some way is problematic about the work, for all the pleasure that it can give. But that seems to be, you know, to my mind, that seems to me to be profoundly American.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
There we are. What do we make of Chamberlain? Well, still find myself glad that these exist in our art world.
I mean, for all that we have a problem with it, the world is richer for the fact of the work, and we're grateful for that.